Welcome to Acton Unwind, an ongoing conversation on a free and virtuous society. I'm your host, Eric Cohn. I want to thank you for listening, and I want to ask that if you're listening to us on our website, that you navigate right now to the show notes for this episode, where you'll find a link to subscribe directly to Acton Unwind at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else where you listen to fine podcasts. And if you like this program, please leave us a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts so as to help more people find our show. This week, I'm joined by Anthony Bradley, Distinguished Research Fellow here at Acton. And later, we'll be joined by Emily Zanotti, Contributing Editor here at the Acton Institute. But this week, we're joined by a special guest, Gene Edward Veith. Gene is Director of the Acton Institute at Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and the author of over 25 books on the topics of Christianity and culture, literature, the arts, classical education, vocation, and theology. Gene is the author of the essay Sheen and Maier, Broadcasting Theology, a review of the book Ministers of a New Medium, Broadcasting Theology in the Radio Ministries of Fulton J. Sheen and Walter A. Maier by Kirk D. Farney, which appears in the spring 2024 issue of our magazine, Religion and Liberty. Religion and Liberty is available at select Barnes & Noble and Books A Million stores across the country, but you can save yourself the time and trouble by subscribing to get our beautiful magazine in your mailbox 4 times per year for only $29.99. We'll include a link where you can subscribe directly to Religion and Liberty in the show notes for today's episode, as well as a link to Gene's essay that we'll be discussing. This week, we'll be discussing if fraternities can save America, or at least their college campuses, and Florida's new ban on lab-grown meat. But first, we want to discuss Gene's essay, again entitled Sheen and Maier, Broadcasting Theology. Gene, tell us, what is your essay about, and what is the book that you were reviewing about?
Yeah, well, it's a review of Kirk Farney's book, Ministers of a New Medium, Broadcasting Theology in the Radio Ministries of Fulton J. Sheen and Walter A. Maier. This is a book, Kirk Farney's on the faculty at Wheaton, and he got his doctorate at Notre Dame, and this was based, I think, on his dissertation research. But it's a fascinating book that really opens up radio, broadcast radio, which began in the 1920s and on through the 50s. This was our first mass medium. And of course, it led directly then to television, because the radio broadcasters, ABC, NBC, CBS, just made that transition to TV and brought their stars like Lucille Ball and Bob Hope and the Lone Ranger into television. And but the impact of radio was so great. I mean, because everybody in the country was listening to the same radio programs. For the first time, all the different regions and groups and states, and they were tied together. They were getting the same news. They were enjoying the same entertainment, listening to the same music, and it was really the beginnings of our mass popular culture. What Farney does is to show the impact of 2 religious radio programs, the Catholic Hour by Fulton J. Sheen and the Lutheran Hour by Walter A. Maier. These programs were hugely popular. Each of them would reach 15 million listeners, which was more than Jack Benny was getting, or Bob Hope, or Frank Sinatra. These are some of the biggest, most popular shows on radio. And I mean, to give you an example, Fox News reaches 1.7 million viewers. That's their average viewership. 15 million Americans were tuning into this Catholic priest and this Lutheran pastor every week. And Varney shows two things that are really fascinating. I mean, you might think, well, yeah, back then people were more interested in religion than they are today. So religious shows what we're going to do better. But the fact is that this was during the period of what scholars call America's religious depression. Kind of along with the economic depression of the 30s was a religious depression when people's attendance at church and religious belief was in many ways worse, a bigger drop off than it is today. And yet, nevertheless, they were listening to this Catholic priest and this Lutheran pastor um, in such numbers that Varney argues it helped bring the country out of the religious depression. And I think his book and studying what these two figures did may give us some ideas for pulling America out of our current religious depression. And the other thing he shows is that these the Lutheran hour and the Catholic hour helped make these two kind of foreign religions, as they were seen by most Americans, that met with a lot of bigotry and suspicion. Of course, anti-Catholicism has been always a big issue in America. This was just after World War I when the anti-German riots were attacking a lot of these Lutheran churches. And Fulton Sheen and Walter A. Maier showed America that Catholicism and Lutheranism were also American religions. And they showed their own people, Catholics and Lutherans, that they too would be good Americans. And it brought these foreign churches really into the American mainstream.
Audio is such a powerful medium, which is a bit of a self-serving thing to say as I'm talking here into a microphone over a medium that is audio that people will be consuming in that way. But it does say something that even as we've had these technological advancements moving to television, moving online to different forms of streaming, that audio-only content continues to be so powerful. There are still talk radio hosts. A lot of that attention has moved to podcasts like the one that we're speaking on now, which should tell you something about the power of the medium that they were engaged in. But there's something to be said about the talent of the individual speaking into the microphone. What was it about Sheen and Maier that made them capable of commanding audiences of millions like that, even at a time, as you point out, where interest in church attendance, in religion, was starting to ebb in the United States, and they play this role in part in helping to bring people back to faith, back to the church. What made them so successful at what they were doing?
Well, both of them were highly educated. Maier had his PhD from Harvard. Fulton Sheen had two doctorates from two European universities. They were both actual theologians. They were both academics. Walter A. Maier was a professor at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. Fulton Sheen was a theology professor at Catholic University in Washington. But they were public intellectuals. They didn't just speak to their fellow specialists in a small and narrow field, like it's often the case now. They knew how to speak to ordinary folks, but they had a lot of intellect, a lot of knowledge, a lot of learning at their service that they used then to give their message an unusual depth in both cases. They were both spellbinding communicators. Fulton Sheen, but here they were different. Fulton Sheen came across in a very intimate, personal way, vividly engaging his audience with anecdotes and stories and descriptions. And it was like talking to a close friend. Walter A. Maier, his style was declamation. He forceful speaker, just but using all the techniques of classical rhetoric to really make his words sink in. And I think this actually was a factor in getting us out of the religious depression. One of the factors that caused that depression was the modernist fundamentalist split of the 20s and throughout that. And what happened is the mainline Protestants mostly went for the modernist, the view that, well, we downplay the doctrines of Christianity, we move to a social gospel of left-wing progressivism. We don't emphasize the Bible because historical critical approach to the Bible shows that these things didn't really happen, downplaying the supernatural, downplaying salvation. And fundamentalists who oppose that, even though they were started by Princeton professors and other very learned individuals, they became caricatured in the culture as kind of ignorant backwoods hicks that still clung to these superstitions. What America heard on both the Catholic hour and the Lutheran hour were two very sophisticated thinkers who were putting forth Orthodox Christianity that had been kind of kicked out of, at least of the modernists. I don't think the Catholics had that problem so much. But when the modernists took over the mainline Protestants, who were dominant in American culture, a lot of people thought, well, if what they're saying is true, why should I get up on Sunday mornings? And they ceased teaching much of any kind of spiritual concerns. Walter A. Maier was giving these Protestants this sample of Orthodox Protestantism and teaching from the Bible that had been missing from a lot of their churches. And no wonder so many of them turned to it and were so receptive to it. And I think that was a big factor of sort of keeping that alive. They defied the usual stereotypes about Orthodox Christianity that were dominant in that time, at least in many circles. But they still gave a different kind of religion than most Americans were used to. And so even the non-Christians, or the people who left the church, were hearing a different kind of Christianity than they had been used to, a different kind even that they had left. And you had Walter A. Maier. He was against, as he said, legalism, the idea of thinking your relation to God is based on, especially minor little lifestyle choices. And so he would speak against prohibition, for example. He came out against that and made headlines all across America. He said it was okay for women to wear makeup. And a lot of the fundamentalists had been sort of promoting these kind of ideas. They too had kind of slipped into a legalism sometimes. And so when you do that, you have to sort of, if you believe your salvation is based on your good works, you have to sort of make the good works easier to do. And so reducing it to something, easy, like not doing certain things or not going out on Saturday nights. And um, that was one people had that view of conservative Christianity. Um, and Fulton Sheen, too, the Catholics were accused of moralism, which I think went beyond just the kind of legalism that Maier was complaining about. But what Sheen did was to emphasize in his broadcast the grace of God, the forgiveness offered by Christ. And I think a lot of Americans felt the Protestants as, oh, Catholics love Jesus too. Didn't realize that. And the Protestants were saying, oh, those Lutherans are against prohibition, but they really believe in the Bible. They really preach the gospel. And so they opened the mind, I think, of a lot of Americans to not only these traditions that they earlier considered and dismissed as being foreign, but it kind of reminded both Catholics and Protestants about what their respective traditions actually believe and taught. And that helped to sort of bring the churches back to life.
For a number of years, used your book on work, on faith and work, theology and work, years and years ago, when I taught both at Covenant Seminary and also at the King's College in New York. I'm really curious to know what you make of the possibility of something like that happening again today. I mean, do you think it would be possible to have, sort of major figures in both traditions, Protestant and Catholics, to capture such a profound audience today?
Yeah, maybe it's different. The communication technology we have today. Radio was about broadcasting, reaching lots of people. The internet specializes in kind of narrowcasting. There's advertising even doesn't try to reach everybody. It reaches a niche.
Well, even as you said with Fox News earlier, right? So they reach 1.7 million people. You look around a lot of modern media and you see a lot of narrowcasting, that they feel it better to have a very sticky 1% of the total possible audience than to broaden their message in a way that might get them 10% of the audience.
Yeah. And if you have, 1,000, listeners, you've done a good job. But having said that, I think it's broadcasting is more challenging now. But I think the strategy is still very telling. A lot of the strategies for church growth, for example, speaking mainly in Protestant circles, has been to be more like the culture. We need to tone down some of our teachings, our moral teachings that put people off. Need to tone down our doctrinal teaching. People don't understand that kind of thing anymore. Let's reach them with practical guides to successful living. In doing that, they've thrown out traditional worship, thrown out traditional music, church music, and in favor of more pop songs, things like people are already listening to. And that obviously has not stopped our religious depression today. In fact, I have argued elsewhere that one of the causes of secularism has been the secularism of the churches. You certainly see that in Europe as the state churches have all adopted the modernist liberal theologies, very progressive, and now hardly anybody goes to them. But there's a good reason why no one goes to them. They're not really teaching much that addresses people's needs. And today, for a while, the evangelicals countered the theological liberalism, and they still do in ways, but there it becomes so secularized too in the way they approach these things in a lot of the contemporary worship movements, and in the church growth, and in extreme cases you have the prosperity gospel, and now even conservatives are adopting a social gospel of the right rather than a social gospel of the left, but amounts to the same thing. They're not conveying the richness of Orthodox Christianity. And that's what you see Fulton Sheen and Walter A. Maier doing. And for our preachers and churches and church leaders, we do have there are a lot of good Christians. There's a really good Christian presence on the internet. Like Catholics and Lutherans and the Reformed and Baptists and everyone. Again, the problem is they're not necessarily reaching the numbers that these radio pastors were doing. But I think in our churches and our local congregations to emphasize again teaching the substance, teaching the depth, the richness of Christianity and of our individual traditions that the different theologians and pastors are part of. I think that's a better strategy. What Fulton Sheen did and Walter A. Maier both, they awaken people's need for God. And they did that very effectively. And you can still hear a lot of these their shows, or you can hear them on YouTube and online, other places, and they still they still hold up. And it's just not the same. Now, in the radio world, even at that time, there were other preachers. But again, a lot of them tended to follow almost the stereotypes. Henry Emerson Fosdick was given a show on NBC, I think it was. He was a prominent liberal, progressive, mainstream spokesman. He got his show was offered free, whereas the Lutherans had to pay for theirs. And there were a lot of the old style evangelists, preaching just like you'll see on Christian television today. But none of them had the resonance of Fulton Sheen and Walter Maier. And I think there's a reason for that. And Christians today, I think, can learn can learn from their strategy and their example.
Yeah, what it seems that one thing that was unique is they were bringing doctrine to life. I think they were being countercultural in the sense that, one, they were standing out amongst the fundamentalists who were really just evangelizing. They were countercultural to the modernists who were kowtowing to the German critical school. They were certainly countercultural to the secular trends as well, but they weren't just quoting Bible passages, right? They weren't just biblicists. They were making doctrine come to life, and perhaps that's what we're missing today, right? We're the sort of, back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, systematic theologians were really sort of the heroes, right? You had, all the way to figures like Niebuhr, for example, right? Just sort of deep philosophical, theological leaders were the center of the discourse, not so much biblical studies and pastors. And so it seems to me, and tell me if you think this intuition is correct, that what we're missing today is sort of orthodox doctrine being applied to life. And that's what they were resurrecting. And that's what people were missing. I think the fundamentalist crowd, they were missing doctrine. The modernist Protestant mainline crowd was missing doctrine. Perhaps also in the Catholic world, they were also missing some rich doctrine. What do you think of those intuitions?
Yeah, you put that really well, bringing and applying doctrine to life, because that's exactly what they did in their broadcasts. That's exactly what they did. And they were not polemical. Catholics and Lutherans both can be very polemical, attacking other traditions. Both of them, on their own, resolved not to do that. That scares people away. They were also resolved to speak to people where they were. Both of them rejected politics. They didn't want to get into politics, and yet they both addressed the moral problems in this country very powerfully. And they were doing that in a countercultural way. Both of them spoke out at a time when this was not always socially acceptable at all by anyone. They spoke out against racism in this country. Walter A. Maier had one sermon where he condemned America for enslaving Black people and continuing to mistreat them. He went on to condemn the way America stole land from the Indians. And then he finished up by condemning anti-Semitism. That was not something people were used to hearing, even from their preachers, much less on popular radio. But they sank deep, and yet they were both very pro-American. They praised the Constitution, Declaration of Independence. They're very patriotic during World War II. They both supported the war effort, but they both opposed. We dropped the atomic bomb on Japan. They spoke against that at the very time when most Americans were so gung-ho about it. Again, that can be debated, but it wasn't debated very much at the time when it happened, except on the Lutheran hour and the Catholic hour. And so they didn't hold back from anything. And yet they did it in a way that people had to take seriously, and it engaged their conscience and their lives, experience, without turning into a matter of politics or voting right or anything like that. It's deeper. The issues were spiritual that they were reaching, and they again made people see their need for God and their need for Christ and their need for salvation. And they were very effective. A lot of people became Christians through their ministry. A lot of people became Catholics, and a lot of people became Lutherans. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, it grew after the war tremendous growth, and over 1.5 million members, and you can still see the signs on some of the old churches. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, the Church of the Lutheran Hour, that had an effect. And I mean, again, some ministries try to separate themselves from the church. Non-denominationalism. Nobody likes denominations. It seems like even the denominations, and they try to downplay all of that. But both of them are very strong churchmen. again, that wasn't their message as such, although Fulton Sheen did explain a lot about Catholicism, why the Virgin Mary is venerated, and he brought out a lot of the distinctives there. But Fulton Sheen, when television began to take the place of radio, he made the transition to television. And the great show, always appearing in the cassock and in his hat and all of the Catholic symbols around him, he kept doing that until 1968. And he was very successful on television. I remember as a kid, very Protestant family, we would watch Fulton Sheen on TV. Walter A. Maier died in 1950. But Lutheran Hours kept going. It's still going. And every time they have a new Lutheran Hour speaker, they always get somebody with a PhD pretty much and good speaker. And they kind of continue that tradition, even as, broadcast radio is in decline now. But you can still hear it online. But these ministries had a strong effect, and they didn't do it by throwing out their traditions or their church bodies, but they found a way to communicate to people where they weren't just proselytizing, they were evangelizing. The Catholic and the Lutheran did that in some different ways, but they both got through to people and had a big impact.
He is Gene Edward Veith. The essay is Sheen and Maier, Broadcasting Theology, a review of the book Ministers of a New Medium, Broadcasting Theology in the Radio Ministries of Fulton J. Sheen and Walter A. Maier by Kirk D. Farney. Gene, thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And of course, we will put a link to that essay in the show notes for this program where you can check it out. Let's go now to our second topic. So we have talked already about what is embroiling college campuses, and it is worth noting, as I believe I probably did the last time too, that we are talking about exceptions, not the rule. There are lots and lots and lots of colleges and universities all across America. Most of them, to the best of my knowledge, do not have the kind of encampments that we are seeing at places like Columbia and Harvard and Yale and Northwestern and a lot of the other elite universities. This is an elite university phenomenon, more or less. Well, I'm sure other campuses are having protests. We have seen others deal with it differently, specifically the University of Florida, which I thought was a pretty good way of handling it, which I think we may have mentioned last week. Former Nebraska Senator Ben Sasse, who's the president there, just putting out a very simple statement of here's what's allowed, here's what's not allowed, here are the consequences for doing things that are not allowed. However, you do get these interesting events where actions provoke reactions, and perhaps not from the places that everybody would expect them to come from. We saw at the University of North Carolina these frat bros who were the ones to stand up, defend the American flag, to be in essence, counter-protesters to the pro-Palestinian and in many cases de facto, if not intentionally, pro-Hamas protesters that they're seeing on these campuses. You even had this GoFundMe that was created to benefit these University of North Carolina frat bros with the idea of throwing them the greatest rager that they've ever seen, which tapped out. I believe they closed it down after raising about $500,000, which is certainly more than they're going to be able to actually expend on a real rager. But
they're going to get it for free, is my understanding. So John Rich is going to throw them the party here in Nashville.
That's amazing.
His Broadway bar. So I don't know what that $500,000 is going to, but
they're
getting the party for free.
Yeah.
It's actually going to charities. They're actually working with their fraternity to figure out which charities to send the money to.
Yeah, which would seem like the inevitable outcome of this. But if you were to read a lot in the media and in popular culture, the reputation of fraternities, and I don't really mean to say this dismissively, but frat bros was perhaps not in the highest regard. And, here you see them coming to the fore, being the ones defending American values, defending the American flag. Anthony, this is something that you've taken a good close look at, the history and the culture around fraternities. What did you make as you watched these things transpire on some of these elite college campuses?
What's really interesting, we tend to see these on elite campuses and not so much state colleges, in part because at your kind of normal college, students, it's the end of a semester and they have to go home and get jobs, right? So they can't really spend time on campuses in tents. It's really interesting. I think fraternities have sort of found their moment. This Pi Kappa Phi fraternity at UNC Chapel Hill just happened to stumble upon a new mission. And it is, I would say, protecting the American project, as they stood outside for about an hour, being pelted by rocks and being shouted at. And what we've seen, particularly on college campuses with fraternity men, they just don't know where they fit into the culture, because on so many campuses, so much of the culture has swung so far to the left that it's been easier for them to just remain silently different, right? So these fraternity men have chosen to, on purpose, say, well, we don't agree with the ways in which, and you might use words like woke in terms of the student body, in terms of the faculty. They really haven't had a place to enter into the discourse, and they have found their place. And so now, because fraternities are so intertwined with the American project, they found a mission, and this is to say the Pledge of Allegiance and sing God Bless America and be the leaders of these counter protests by saying, hey, we think America's great. We love institutions. We love American history. We love traditions. We love the sort of things that make this country really outstanding. Fraternities are going to be much more patriotic and much more willing to say, the country's imperfect, but also we're willing to champion that, and to do that on the very same campuses where they're having these pro-Palestinian protests. For them has been really, really opportunistic and really quite brilliant in terms of a happy accident. So I'm kind of happy for them. They found something to do. They found a mission. They found something to keep them really, really busy in terms of fighting for the American project. So we'll see. We'll see how it rolls out. There's been some that have gone too far and have made some mistakes, but in terms of thinking about the kinds of things that fraternity men could be about on a college campus, I think saying the Pledge of Allegiance and singing God Bless America are the sorts of things that we might want them to do rather than some other things.
Yeah, I would be remiss if I didn't read at least part of the description from this GoFundMe, because I want to find who wrote it, because it's fantastic. But amidst the chaos, the screaming, the anti-Semitism, the hatred of faith and flag, stood a platoon of American heroes, armored in vineyard vines in Patagonia, fueled by Zin and White Claws. These triumphant Bohemians protected Old Glory from the unwashed Marxist horde, laughing at their shrieks and wails and shielding the Stars and Stripes from Soviet missiles. These boys, no men of the UNC frats, gave the best to America, and now they deserve the best. Yeah, Anthony, I think as you were kind of referencing there, there's been... We've seen some videos, and there's the one particular, I believe it was from Ole Miss, where the line, the vanguard of the frat bros was responding to a protester who was a black woman, and it looks like one of the people was perhaps, making gorilla or kind of monkey gestures at this person. While I certainly find that to be deplorable, I don't know that we really want to get into evaluating the excesses of these different movements because while again, of course, in anything with a racist intent, and again, we're reading intent into this when we don't actually know. If there's anything that we should have learned from, say, like the Covington Catholic moment, that a little clip of video or a single photograph doesn't necessarily tell us the entire story. But let's go ahead and assume that what a lot of people think we saw is what we actually saw there. I don't think we want to get into that, evaluating the extremes and excesses of these particular movements, because we can certainly do chapter and verse on the photos that you have seen of, El Qassam's next target sign pointing to a gathering of Jewish students waving the Israeli flag. Plenty of blame to go around if we're going in that game. But what I find fascinating, Emily, is the way that this, if I want to go back to my own college experience, you thought of the social fraternities, even on my tiny little campus in central Illinois, as they're there for parties on Friday and Saturday nights, and they do some charity work around campus and that kind of stuff. But primarily it's a social organization. All of them have a mission, but in a lot of cases, I think those missions have been lost over time as they've just kind of become social clubs on college campuses. But what I again find fascinating is finding this kind of very American patriotic cause to latch onto. You wonder about the thought process, or does this kind of become this emergent thing? Is it reactionary in the sense of seeing what they were seeing on their campuses and thinking, well, we need to do something in the name of this country or decency? I find the phenomenon pretty fascinating.
I think it's partly a cultural thing, largely because where this is happening is in SEC schools. And that is a very Southern phenomenon, where fraternities and sororities are a little bit different than they are in the Big Ten or up north. You've seen this kind of resurgence of trying to figure out what fraternities and sororities do on SEC campuses with the Ole Miss and the Auburn and the Alabama. The University of Alabama is a big one. Bama Rush. So the sororities are now all online, and all the process of becoming a member, specifically of a sorority at Bama, is an entirely online process. And so they've had a chance to sort of revisit their PR to some extent. But I think, and this was mentioned sort of early on in the protests, well, you don't see this happening at SEC schools. You don't see this happening at Southern schools. Yes, it's a little bit more rural. Yes, it's a little bit more conservative. But I think just the attitude on campus is very different. And so when it came down to what happened at UNC, you had protesters who were kind of far enough north to still be connected to the protests, things like Columbia and Brown and George Washington. But you had it taking place in a very different type of community with very different type of fraternity brothers. And so once they did it, it sort of caught on across the South, where these were starting to crop up. You certainly didn't see it happen at the University of Michigan, where we have been sort of battling this anti-Zionism for a very, very long time, probably since the Vietnam War concluded. This was just their new thing that they moved on to in the early 70s. And so I think it's partly a cultural thing, too, that you're just seeing people who grew up with a bigger respect for the American flag and for the U.S. and what they gave them. They're sort of steeped in this Southern culture, and then they come up against these pro-Palestinian or in some ways pro-Hamas protesters, and they see an opportunity to do something. So it's got a lot of facets to it.
Anthony, I want to give you an opportunity here to talk to talk your book. Talk a little bit about, you have this book, Heroic Fraternities: How College Men Can Save Universities and America. I mean, you couldn't ask for better guerrilla marketing for that, could you?
You couldn't, and actually, I've noticed over the last few days, my sales have gone way, way up. I've been tracking it on Amazon. I'm not exactly sure why, but I'm happy for this accident. What's really fascinating is that if you look at the fraternities in the South, they're also I wouldn't say large. I wouldn't necessarily say largely, but people would be surprised at how populated they are by kids from the North, right? So you have all these students from New England, from the Mid-Atlantic states who want a quote-unquote college experience. And so they come down south and they want to join a fraternity. And so if you look at the fraternity members of Pi Kappa Phi at UNC Chapel Hill, a lot of those aren't Southerners, right? They're sort of kids who came, high academic standards, et cetera. And what you find in fraternities across the country, you'll often see imprints of the American flag in their Greek lettering, and they'll have it on their fraternity house, they'll have it on T-shirts, and it doesn't really matter if the fraternity is necessarily in the South. The fraternity could be somewhere in the Midwest, but the history of fraternities is uniquely linked to the history of America, as I said earlier. And what you have is, I think, a group of men, as I said earlier, who are looking for something to do outside of Greek life, a mission, something that sort of transcends what they're doing. And so in the book, I kind of make the case that if we activate fraternity members, because they tend to end up in Congress, they tend to be the leaders of Fortune 500 companies, they tend to be those who were running for president and vice president. They ascend to these positions of leadership, that if we can turn them into factories of virtue rather than vice, right? I think we can really use this community. And what I've been thinking about more recently is that because fraternity culture tends to be, in terms of its membership across the country, and you actually do see this, for example, at the University of Michigan. I interviewed recently a fraternity member at the University of Michigan and Alpha Delta Phi. And in that fraternity at Michigan, what he told me is that in their chapter, they have a range of political views. And one of the things that they do is they have figured out how to have different political views, how to have viewpoint diversity and remain friends, because there's a context there, they can talk those things out. So I'm really quite encouraged that as these fraternity members rise up to offer up this American project, that maybe this could be an opportunity for universities to use these counter protests to open up space next fall to have civil discourse about the sorts of things that divide our country so radically. And fraternities just offer a counter narrative to some of the anti-American sentiment. But we needed to have universities be the place that model civil discourse with respect to people who disagree. And I'm just convinced that fraternities could bring that back, both in the university, but also by releasing these men into society, because they've had experience having to live and eat and enjoy meals with people with whom they disagree.
Yeah, the whole point of, I believe it's from de Tocqueville, the line of, you get three Americans together and they'll elect a treasurer. The idea of the way that we institution build in the United States in ways that other countries don't. Institutions have to have a purpose. They have to have something that they're trying to do. And before we move on, Anthony, I want to ask you one more question on this, which is, do you think that, one, would it be a fair characterization to say that fraternities at universities had largely lost their way in kind of like, what is their reason for existing beyond being just a social club, just a something that, what I observed from my experience 20 years ago now on a college campus, where they were just the places where you would go because you knew there would be parties on Friday and Saturday night. But the thing that was supposed to be the animating reason for their existence had kind of fallen off. Interestingly enough, I kind of dealt with it on an inverse version of it. The fraternity that I was in, Phi Mu Alpha, was a social fraternity when it was created, but it was created at a music school. So that was the organizing principle behind it, was people kind of gathering in brotherhood around music. And because of the way that we saw the evolution of fraternity and Greek life in general on college campuses through the 50s into the 60s, 70s, and 80s, my fraternity got confused for being being essentially a professional fraternity. And there's a couple years where under, I believe, Title IX, they were required to admit women. So there are some women members, alumni members of Phi Mu Alpha. But its purpose was always as a male-only social fraternity that just happened to be formed at a college of music, and that gave it its organizing principle. They had the opposite problem in that because they'd maintained that central reason for existence, people thought there's no way you can be a social fraternity. The social fraternities are just the ones who are having parties on Friday and Saturday nights. So do you think that it would be a fair characterization to say they lost their way? And do you see this as part of them coming back, finding their reason for existing beyond just being that social club and having the organizing principle, the idea underlying them this is why we're getting people of different backgrounds and different beliefs and different political philosophies together for a singular purpose?
That's a fantastic question. It really depends on the campus and the culture, as Emily was saying. I think depending on where you are, these fraternities have values, they have virtues. Those are often, in many cases, formed in the late 19th century. So a lot of them are based on the classical virtues, and many of them are actually come right out of the scriptures, or they're paraphrased from the Bible. And I would say that 1978, when Animal House came out, that was basically the watermark. I mean, that was the point where for the large part, you had a generation of Gen Xers who watched that movie and said, when I go to college, I'm going to do that. And after Animal House is when it really, really got, it became so bad that today most universities want to get rid of fraternities altogether. And so there are some movements now where fraternities are actually focusing on virtue formation, character formation, professional development. They're trying to move away from simply being context for parties and licentiousness. I can name just a few at the national level, right? So the national leadership of Lambda Chi Alpha, for example, is really focusing right now on shifting a culture to character development. Phi Delta Theta is also doing that. The Triangle Fraternity is also about that as well. So you're right. They have lost their way on a lot of campuses, and because there's so much pressure now on fraternities to not be liabilities to their campuses, fraternities are looking for a reason or looking for ways to justify their existence in terms of adding value to a university culture that's not merely social. I think that's why, or in the past, they focus genuinely on charities, right? They're saying, hey, no, we're good guys. We're really good guys. And I make the case, it's not really a charity that makes you good guys. It's you being men of character and virtue that makes you good guys. And I think with this potential movement now, they can say, no, we are men who add value to our campuses by being lovers of tradition. We're not deconstructionists. We do value the flag. We are patriotic. We do value solidarity and brotherhood, and we believe America is a great place, and we want to champion that. And I think that could really bring them back, like you said, to their original mission, where they can promote their values and virtues by making their campuses better.
Let's move now to our final topic. Where is the beef? It's in Florida, and it is going to stay in Florida at least as long as it is not grown in a laboratory. New legislation that has been signed by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. I will now read here from an article in the New York Times. Florida has banned making and selling meat that is grown in a laboratory, a move several other states have considered amid worries about consumer safety and concerns that the technique could hurt the beef and poultry industries. A number of startup companies are developing technologies to grow beef, chicken, and fish by using cells taken from animals without harming or slaughtering them. The process is expensive, and the widespread availability of so-called lab-grown meat is years away. Beef and poultry associations, as well as some conservatives, have opposed the industry, calling it anti-farmer. In a news release announcing that he had signed the ban, Governor Ron DeSantis said his administration was committed to investing in local farmers and ranchers. Quote, "We will save our beef," he said. I think I'm appreciative of the framing of this and of the honesty from people like Ron DeSantis that this is protectionism, that this is it almost the kind of the thing that you sometimes have to search to find the perfect example of is so clearly laid out here in the first paragraph from this New York Times story. You have the combination of, quote, worries about consumer safety and then concerns that the technique could hurt the beef and poultry industries, right? So this is like your perfect bootlegger and Baptist combination here, that you have the people who are proclaiming to be so deeply concerned about the health and well-being of people who might make a free decision of their own accord to try this product that is masquerading as the reason for taking an action like this, when the real reason is to protect industries that are often big financial contributors to politicians and have huge interests in individual states and in the country as well. I just see, Emily, no, I don't personally have a desire to be, the first one through the meat wall and be the one to try lab-grown meat myself. However, I'm enough of an animal person that I want to be clear here. I feel conflicted about things like, factory farming and things like that. I don't love the conditions, but I also love the fact that we essentially do not have problems of, not having enough food or, people starving around the world. And a lot of that has to do with techniques that have been developed over time that have allowed us to do things on scale that wasn't previously possible. So I find this just to be such a perfect example of the kind of politics that disgusts me, of proclaiming interest in protecting the well-being of individuals in order to protect the interests of very well-heeled and well-financed specific interests.
Yeah, and this might not even really be local farmers. It's probably some sort of high-level conglomerate factory farming or factory ranching. It's an industry that is essential to Florida's GDP. So certainly, when it comes down to it, they don't want lab-grown meat in Florida not because it's disgusting and gross, or you have some sort of moral objection to growing meat in a lab, but ultimately it's because there's cattle ranchers who just don't want you to. And, as maybe the only chicken farmer among this group, chickens are a pretty self-sustaining livestock. They have babies like crazy, and I own chickens. I do not feel bad about eating chicken because they are dumber than bricks. But ultimately, this is a great example of protectionism disguised as a conservative policy. It's essentially handicapping business, which we don't want to do, handicapping scientific improvement, which we don't necessarily want to do. And sometimes for people like me, I can't eat shellfish. I have a massive allergy to shellfish, but it's actually to the shells. So there is a possibility that lab-grown lobsters, lab-grown shrimp, lab-grown, all sorts of, shellfish and bug type crawfish are a good example, that I will then now be able to eat lobster ravioli. Now, is it a huge thing for me to be able to eat lobster ravioli and risotto? No, but there is a possibility that I don't have to deal with this food allergy going forward. So there are ethical reasons maybe to continue to experiment with this, but really all Ron DeSantis did was just protect a burgeoning chicken farm industry in Florida.
Yeah, this reminds me of the great Adam Smith quote of, "I've known little good to be done by those who affect to trade for the public good." And of course, the key word in there is affect to trade for the public good. People who, as Milton Friedman explained that quote one time, nobody goes before Congress and says, "Give me $1 million because I'm a good person and I deserve $1 million." They go before Congress to say, "Give me $1 million because I'm going to do good for all of these people." This is a different form of that same kind of thing of, protect our industry because we're so good and we're so important here. And then you affix this kind of reason onto the front of it. Anthony, at the risk of making this the Anthony Bradley Talks His Book episode of Acton Unwind, I want you to weigh in here on any element of this, the government action portion, the protectionism part of it. But you've also, in the issue of R&L that contains Gene Veith's essay that we discussed at the beginning of the program, you also have an essay on diet. And, of course, what kind of food you consume, whether that is, food that is grown in a lab or raised on a cattle ranch or in Emily's backyard in terms of the chickens that she has, those are all things that feed into what you were discussing in that essay. So feel free to swing at this piñata from whatever angle you'd like to whack it from. Well,
what's really interesting to me is that if you look at Beyond Meat's stock price, over the last several years, it's plummeted. I think
that picture that always gets shared that I know is just one single incident in time of I think it was like a hurricane or something was approaching in the grocery store, and anybody who has relatives in Florida who has lived in Florida knows that just the same as here in Michigan when a snowstorm is coming, everybody goes and buys up all of the food from the grocery store, and all the Beyond Meat items were all still left there, which if that stuff works for you, that's fantastic, but it tells you something about the general public sentiment of that product.
Yeah, it was during the pandemic.
Yeah.
We were locked in.
That's right.
I mean, we were like, hey, let's try fake meat. And so everybody went out and bought Beyond Meat. And basically what happened is as soon as the pandemic ended, people were like, you know what? I like actual meat, real meat.
They got beyond meat very fast.
Very, very fast. And so consumers were actually making the decision. It's really interesting. About 80% of the beef produced in this country comes from 4 or 5 companies, right? We get about 20 to 25% of our beef from imports. So this is protectionism in terms of the beef industry. And for me, I'm like, listen, why don't we just educate people about good eating and let them decide? And what we're seeing is that if we let people decide, let them try it, right? And if they don't like it, they don't have to buy it. That's what exactly happened with Beyond Meat. People got educated about it. What they realized is that it's processed food. And if you're someone who was trying to avoid processed foods, because processed foods includes, by definition, tons of chemicals and additives, right? You have to have food coloring for fake meat. You have to have an extremely chemical process to produce it. It's a sludge. You have to make it into something that looks and tastes like meat. It's just full of chemicals, right? So if you're someone who's trying to avoid those things, they try it out, but let the market decide. I was sort of shocked. Well, maybe not shocked that they chose to outright ban it. But that's actually not the best way, I think, for the beef industry to protect itself. I say, hey, compete and let people know the health benefits, which my article argues that there are benefits to not eating processed food, period. Let people experience that and let them decide. And over time, and we've already seen this with Beyond Meat, people are going to make the best decisions. And in the end, I think the maybe natural meat industry is going to win in the end, because that's what we're seeing consumers choose. Now, I will say this does alarm me, because it seems to me I could easily see, and this is me being conspiratory, right? I could see this as the conspiracy theory of the century. I could very easily see that fast food would want fake meat produced, right? And if the fast food industry, like your chicken nuggets were soy nuggets or pea protein nuggets, and they were in this thing together, the population that will suffer the most in terms of health consequences and everything else from some sort of collaboration between the fake meat industry and fast food is going to be low-income people. Because those people that have capacity and wealth to opt out of a system that can purchase high-end grass-fed beef, they're going to do that regardless, right? But it's going to be people that don't have as much financial access to those sorts of high-quality, nutrient-dense protein options are going to find themselves potentially having to make decisions about, am I going to buy some fake meat in Aldi or the real thing? That would be sort of my one concern. Are my chicken nuggets going to be pea pea protein or some other kind of chicken parts. And so I'm sort of thinking about that as well. But the ban to me is not really helpful. I just think consumers, if they're educated properly, will make the right kind of decision. And Beyond Meat is learning a really painful lesson because of it.
Yeah, so I was in the Impossible. Impossible Meat is also learning that lesson. I noticed because we get a weekly box called like Misfits Market or something, and it's Whole Foods as cast-offs or things that aren't quite, they're close to their sell-by date or whatever. And the last like 6 weeks, it has been nothing but Impossible food, Impossible burgers, Impossible chicken nuggets. I won't even buy this on clearance. But to some extent, I think this is an environmental thing. I think the lab-grown meat is one of these kind of Bill Gates, we're going to save the planet from climate change by eliminating
That's definitely
cows.
Part of the argument.
And because cows fart methane has an impact. So chickens are similar. Chickens produce compost at an alarming rate. So you're talking about the central facet of this being environmentalism. And so Ron DeSantis is standing in opposition to radical environmentalism. But again, I think to echo Anthony's point, I think as with a lot of things that happen with the pro-environmentalism movement, it's a lot of limousine liberalism. Certainly people who have no choice but to own a car will never not own a car because they need to get to work. They need to get to 2 or 3 part-time jobs. They need to pick up their kids. There's going to be people who cannot live without washing machines, who cannot live without dishwashers, who cannot live without meat. We disparage McDonald's a lot, but with the double cheeseburger is like the most nutrient dense, cheapest food in world history, right? Like you can go to McDonald's for $2 and you can get a meal. And so I think a lot of this is I can afford to have my own supply of eggs and my own supply of chickens because there is no ROI on backyard farming, right? It's just good money after bad. So that's very privileged. You're going to see a lot of people who live in urban environments who can take public transportation because it's right outside of their apartments, or they say that they have the advantage when it comes to living a conservation style life. But the truth is, it's just money and power and privilege. When it comes down to it, a lot of these policies hurt people who are lower income, who are poor, who need to rely hand to mouth on paychecks hand to mouth, who need to rely on cheap sources of food. And, I can see the argument, but it's just, you can't shut down an industry. All that does is really create all sorts of new problems with power in your governmental agency.
I want to make 2 points. One of them is about education and the other is about morality. The education point, this was something that was driven home to me because I believe it was Obamacare, or perhaps it was just prior to that, where they started to mandate that places would have to list the calorie counts on menu items that you were ordering, particularly places like fast food restaurants. And it turned out to not have the effect that the people who came up with this idea thought that it was going to have. They thought if they put these huge calorie counts up there, and people would look at it and go like, ordering 2 Big Macs and 2 large orders of fries and a giant Diet Coke is in excess of my total calorie intake of the average day. I shouldn't do that. What it revealed is that people don't know what their calorie count should be for an average day. And the numbers that they saw on the boards, they thought were actually smaller than they were going to be. And as a result, they ordered more food as a result of it, which really underscores the point of the failure in education when it comes to things like food and diet. Like, what is the recommended number of calories, for your, height, weight, body, all that stuff. Figuring that out, being able to figure that out for yourself, being able to make those kinds of informed decisions. Again, when we just assume everybody knows what the recommended daily allotment should be. It turns out many people don't, and that their misestimations of it turn out to skew in the wrong direction, not in the right direction. The point about morality, I think, is interesting for anybody who has read not his two most recent books, but the book that preceded those two by Jonathan Haidt, The Righteous Mind, where he gets into these explorations of this moral basis for the way that we engage in things like religion and politics in public, particularly for conservatives, the instinct towards disgust and cleanliness is pretty pronounced. So in a way, it's not surprising to me that this is coming from the political right that is looking to ban something like lab-grown meat. And I think this is the point that I want to make here is that people who are in that industry need to understand that's going to be a reaction to when people hear something like, and I know they probably didn't choose this term for themselves, lab-grown meat. Not the best marketing. If you want people to actually consume it, saying, hey, here's a thing that like Pinky in the Brain grew in the laboratory, it conjures up kind of like Frankenstein images rather than what it is. I mean, you as Emily was pointing out, you're going to have the ability to appeal to different groups of people based on their different interests here. You have environmentalists, you're going to have people who are concerned about things like animal rights, people who are concerned about the cost of food, if this is able to bring down those costs. They need to better understand and position their product. And I know I'm the marketing guy, so of course I'm making this point. But if the lab-grown meat people really want this to be a success, first they're going to have to understand the political and regulatory environment that they're about to be existing in. And Ron DeSantis, thankfully, has clued them into that very quickly. But they're also going to need to understand the marketing of their own product. And again, I'm not saying that they chose lab-grown meat, but it's when it's the term we're all using to describe this thing, they're probably not going to want to let that thing get away from them.
And it may not be a commercial product at all. Like I said, it may be really useful for people like me who have deadly food allergies. There may be some use for it in the event that, like right now, we have avian bird flu that's affecting chickens. We have tuberculosis that's affecting cows. There may certainly be times in the future where we are not able to take as much advantage of our beef stock or our agricultural growth, or some years may be leaner than others. And then there's this lab-grown meat that is available for some people who may want it. So it may not actually be a consumer product at all. It's just sort of a backup product, but they seem desperate to want it to be a consumer product. And I just don't think that is going to work out for them.
And I would also add that the environmental impact is actually not what they want. There was a study done at UC Davis in their Department of Food Science and Technology. I want to be clear for people to think this through. Fake meat is a production process. It requires the use of energy, requires the use of chemical additives, as I said earlier. And it creates waste. Right? It's a production process. A cow's waste is natural, and we reuse it all the time, right? People will buy bags of it for their flowers in the coming weeks. What the researchers found at UC Davis is this. They essentially said they ran a study, and the study said that, quote, the global warming potential of lab-based meat using all of the production requirements necessary to produce it is 4 to 25 times greater than the global warming average of retail beef, regular beef, right? So this idea that lab-based grown meat doesn't impact the environment is just patently false. Mm-hmm. No production process of anything whatsoever has a positive impact on the environment. So this argument that lab-based meat is better for the environment than retail natural meat is simply not true.
one final story to punctuate that point. I have a friend who used to live in Chicago and was dating this woman who lived in Lincoln Park in Chicago, had a townhome. Emily, of course, you'll be familiar with this. You have often like the little patch of grass right in front of the townhome. And she was telling my friend, is like, when you come over later, I got to show you this. I got a green lawnmower. He's like, huh? It's like a green lawnmower. He's like, wait, is it like, the manual push kind with the rotating blades? Because, my dad said, why do I need a self-propelled lawnmower? I've got 3 boys. She's like, no. It's a green lawnmower. He's like, wait, is it a John Deere? Is it actually like physically green? She's like, no. So he gets there. She takes him out to the garage and says, see, it's a green lawnmower. It's electric. And my friend says, it runs on coal. She's like, no. See, you plug it into the wall here and you charge it. It's electric. He's like, yeah, but to get the electricity from the wall, there's a train pulling up in Pilsen with coal that's dumping coal into a power plant that's burning it and giving all the people around their black lung. It runs on coal. And her response to that was, why do you have to be so mean? He's like, that's when I knew this relationship was not working out. But it underscores a point that, people don't think below the first level too often. That they see it's just electricity that comes out of the wall, and electric is better. But how are you getting the electricity, right? So we can get, we've run very long. We don't need to, go into the, if you're being serious about environmental stuff, you have to be in favor of nuclear energy, which I think is an absolute must. But, people don't think below that first level very often. So it's unsurprising to me that people would hear is like, oh, lab-grown meat, it's a way to not have so many cows out there and not release the methane and all of that, without thinking of what you're subbing in for not having the actual real animal livestock.
Yeah, it's going to take a lot of coal to fire the production plant to create fake meat.
Let's call it a wrap there. Thank you for listening to Acton Unwind. If you're listening to this podcast on our website, please look in the show notes where you'll find a link where you can subscribe directly to Acton Unwind, or just search Acton Unwind on your favorite podcast app. Also, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, 5-star reviews only, so that more people can find our show. I want to again encourage you to subscribe to our magazine, Religion and Liberty, where you can read not only Gene's great essay that we discussed today, but other great pieces by Mike Cosper, our own Anthony Bradley, Karen Swallow-Pryor, Dan Huger, and many more. Only $29.99 will get 4 issues of our beautiful magazine in your mailbox 4 times per year. Again, look in the show notes for this episode where you'll find a link to subscribe. Thanks to Anthony, thanks to Emily, and a big thanks to Gene Edward Veith. For the Acton Institute, I'm Eric Cohn. We'll see you next week.